Hello and welcome to another video review. This is BioShock Infinite for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3. This is a first-person shooter and the third game in the BioShock series, although it is not a sequel or prequel directly to BioShock 1 or 2. It's kind of a weird way of doing it. But it's developed by Irrational Games, published by 2K in February of this year, and it was released to a massive amount of acclaim. It was pretty much the first big hit of the year. And I wasn't really expecting it to get the amount of praise that it did. Don't get me wrong, I was expecting it to get a lot of praise because it is a BioShock game, but I wasn't really expecting people to act like it was this new standard for game writing and all sorts of things like that. I was just like, what? Are people just going crazy over it? I mean, I felt like with the original BioShock, it was a good game, but it was marred by its gameplay more than anything else. And the fact that it's pretty much just System Shock 2, only more simplified in a different setting and such like that. And I felt like BioShock 2 was just a cash grab. It wasn't a particularly good game. But when I looked at Infinite, I thought, I'll give it a shot. It certainly got some interesting concepts, and the setting and everything looked interesting to me, so I figured I'd pick it up. And luckily it went on sale for surprisingly cheap. I was not expecting its price to drop so quickly, so that's a very good thing on my case, obviously, because otherwise I probably wouldn't have gotten to review this until next year. But the real question is, does this improve upon what the original BioShock did well? Or is it more of a continuation of what happened with BioShock 2, where it's just kind of a cash grab? But before I answer that question, let's first talk about the presentation. As far as the visuals go in this game, it's kind of a weird thing. Because on the one hand, you have the visual quality being up-end for a console game. It certainly looks very good for a console game. Textures are decent res, although on PC you do notice that they are more low-res than what you really want out of PC gaming. The modeling is very well done. Animations are nice, smooth, and fluid. Flow together really well. And actually work really, really well for the game. And I actually didn't notice all that much clipping or anything like that in the game. There is some of it, but it's not very often. So they did a good job with making sure these animations do work quite well. And there are quite a few nice particle effects, although I do feel like they used bloom lighting way too much, because in a lot of spots it really does blind you quite a bit, and I'm sure there's a deliberate choice behind that, but it does get kind of annoying sometimes. Luckily, that's not all the time. It's just certain areas, and when you're looking a certain way, it gets kind of weird. Now, on PC, they do use some DirectX 11 effects, but I never really noticed it all that much. It looked like a high-end DX9 game, so I don't really know what they use as far as that goes. I did notice that performance on my end was just kinda eh. It was running around 30 frames per second for most of the game. And that was actually fine for this particular game, which kind of weirded me out, because I'm used to wanting 60 frames a second or higher in an FPS. But it worked out okay in this one. I guess it's more optimized for 30 frames a second or something like that, but maybe it's just because it's a bit of a slower paced FPS than other stuff out there right now. But as far as the technical side of things go, they did a pretty good job with it, but it's nothing particularly amazing. It's how they used it that really propels the visuals forward. The game does have quite a bit of color in it, and that is greatly appreciated. I shouldn't have to say, hey, the game is colorful, this is a good thing. I shouldn't have to say that, but it's noteworthy of games these days. And it really does help to bring this world to life. Just all of these subtle visual touches there, too, really do bring the visuals forward and create a very nice visual atmosphere that's actually kind of hard to describe, because you have to combine it with all the rest of the atmosphere that's in this game. So, part of that is created by the sound design, which is phenomenal as well. On the one hand, you have sound effects, which are greatly improved over the previous BioShock games, and particularly with gun sounds, which sound really nice and beefy this time around. And the voice acting in particular, which the voice cast in this game did a phenomenal job. From the protagonist, Booker DeWitt, who is played by Troy Baker, he did a fantastic job as the character, to the actress who played Elizabeth. I can't remember her name off the top of my head. I apologize for that. But she did a really good job. To the rest of the voice cast, for all of the major characters, and even the lesser characters, they all did phenomenal jobs and really do help to bring this world to life. And in fact, the voice acting is so well done, it doesn't really feel like a video game as far as the voice acting goes. It feels like more like a movie or actual characters, as opposed to just, oh, they're a bunch of pixels that happen to have voice associated with them. And that's another thing that really ties in with the visuals. They did a lot to tie all of this together, and between the visuals and the voice acting, and really make these characters come to life. So kudos to them for that. And then you have the music to the game, which is very appropriate for the period, and they do actually have quite a few anachronistic songs in there as well, and they actually work out quite well, because it doesn't really parade them around or anything like that. And in those contexts where they're used, it actually works out really well in the game's favor. But the period soundtrack is actually really well done, and it's kind of weird that I'm saying that because I don't normally like music like that. But it works out really well in this particular case. But what really matter are the story and the gameplay, and I'm actually going to break my usual form here and talk about the gameplay first. It plays out pretty much like you'd expect BioShock to play out. It follows the same kind of formula, where there's still exploration, where you run around the world around you and try to find all sorts of equipment and audio logs and that sort of thing. And they also still have the FPS combat mixed with the sort of supernatural element with, in the original game in BioShock 2, it was plasmids. But in this one, they've changed that specifics. It's still there, but they changed the specifics. And they still have a non-regenerating health system. The difference is they've changed a lot of the specifics. The health system, for instance, they've removed the ability to have medkits with you. And what that means is you actually just have to go around finding medkits or food items to replenish your health, as opposed to the previous two games where you would just carry around a bunch of medkits, and whenever you take damage, you'd tap the medkit button, and oh look, your health was replenished. But the way they sort of remedied that in this one was they gave you a magnetic shield at the beginning of the game. This allows you to take a few hits before actually taking health damage, and the shield does regenerate. Your health does not. So that encourages you to play a bit more recklessly than you did in the previous games, and that actually helps to make the combat a bit faster paced. So that's worth noting. You can also find infusions all over the place that will allow you to increase your selection of the health meter, the shield meter, or the salts meter. Now, the salts are what replace Eve. You can't carry around any sort of salt items, much like with what they did with the health system. So it's no longer carrying around a bunch of Eve hypos, and whenever you run out of that, you just use a Eve hypo, and oh look, you've got full Eve again. Now, in this one, you have to go around finding items that will give you salts, like soda or coffee or actual bottles of salts. And they, in certain parts of the game, actually have machines that will dispense salts, and those are pretty handy, but they're very few and far between. They did alter up the actual specifics of how many of these things you get and how useful they are as well. You get 8 of them throughout the entire game, and each of them has a secondary fire. For instance, the Shock Jockey Vigor, which was one that I used as soon as I got it, I used it for the rest of the game. And the primary fire on that is a quick zap of electricity that will stun enemies and do a small amount of damage. The secondary fire is when you hold the button down. This is across the board. You will hold the button down for the secondary fire. But when you hold the button down, it will create a shock mine that you can throw in a certain spot, and then when enemies wander into it, it will do the same effect that the primary fire does. So, stuff like that happens throughout all of the vigors. Each of them has their own secondary fires. Each of them is different. Each of them is used in its own specific way. But the problem is, I found myself only using a couple of them throughout the entire game. Those were the Shock Jockey one, which I just described to you, and the Possession one, which allows you to bring things over to your side. That's pretty much all I used. I did try out a lot of the other ones just to see what they did, but that was kind of it. I only tried them out to see what they did. I didn't find them particularly useful. So it was more of a, oh, do I just feel like using it at this given point? Sure, why not? They also altered a lot of the FPS mechanics. And that also ties in sort of with the Vigors because of the combat system. You now have a 2-weapon limit, which means that you'll probably be using your Vigors a lot more now.
I imagine they were interested in meeting you.
But this 2-weapon limit is a problem because typically you want to have up to 3 weapons at any given point. You want something for close range, you want something for long range, and you want something that's good against heavily armored opponents. In this game, they decided to change things up. As a result, you have weapons like the hand cannon, which is ridiculously powerful. It will take out most enemies in 1 hit. Maybe 2 if you're a really bad shot. And as a result, the weapon selection is actually pretty minimal because you'll only be using a handful of weapons at any given point, probably. You might use the carbine, the RPG, the sniper rifle, and the hand cannon. And that's kind of it, unless, of course, you just happen to run out of ammo for something and you just pick up, say, a machine gun or a shotgun. Now, the shotgun is certainly powerful, but it's a very close-range weapon, so obviously that limits its effectiveness. Unlike in BioShock 1 and 2, there are actually quite a few open areas in this game, and medium to long-range engagements are not uncommon in this thing, unlike in the previous ones where it was pretty much all close range. So that's worth noting. Long-range weapons are kind of the king of this game, and the hand cannon's kind of one of those. It's also worth noting that they have this really annoying snap-to targeting, where if you press the button to go into iron sight mode, it will actually snap to an enemy, and most of the time I found it snapped pretty much to their head, so I was getting headshots left, right, and center doing that, so I stopped using it, and instead I just started using the crosshair and got the same result. The difference being it didn't give me any aim assist. Now this was on PC, mind you, so aim assist is pretty much unforgivable, particularly considering I couldn't find a way to turn it off. That was really annoying. But anyway, enemies are a lot less bullet spongy in this one than they were in the previous games, and that also makes the weapons more powerful than they were before. You can also upgrade them to make them even more powerful. Now, keep in mind that in the previous games, when you had to upgrade a weapon, or you didn't really have to, it was up to you. But when you upgraded a weapon, you would go to a Power to the People station, and you would get a one-time upgrade. And whatever single upgrade you chose would render the machine inoperable, and you couldn't get any more upgrades from it. So you had to really pick and choose what you wanted to use from your very wide arsenal. In this one, however, you can go to any armory vending machine and buy any upgrades that you can afford throughout the entirety of the game. And you will also be swimming in loot by the end of the game, so this is not a problem. You can also do the same thing for the Vigors, although Vigors only have a 3-tier upgrades, I think. It's either 2 or 3. And weapons generally have 4. So it's kind of a weird situation, because the weapons are already really powerful to begin with, and then you upgrade them to be even more powerful. It's kind of crazy. Now, one thing they did do well was the movement, which is a lot faster in this game than it was in the previous 2. That is a godsend, because I felt like you moved like you were made of lead in the previous 2. And in this one, you can walk still, but you can also sprint, and you can jump on the skylines, which make you move a lot faster. You can also do skyline strikes from those, which are rather satisfying. You jump off of them and hit the enemy with your skyhook and send them flying. But the skylines add a lot of verticality to the game, so you will find that those also make the long-range engagements much more possible and much more effective, actually. You will find that they also give you a really good way of getting away from enemies if you're in a tight spot, or just getting to certain areas to get a really good vantage point and that sort of thing. So that adds a different dynamic to the gameplay that's very wildly different from BioShock 1 and 2. But it's also worth saying that all of this blended together doesn't really help the game's difficulty. Now, you've already guessed by now it's kind of easy, but it's made even more easy by the lack of resource scarcity, not only in health kits and such like that, but ammunition, which is all over the place. You'll find tons of ammo, you find tons of money. Even Elizabeth will give you money over time, so you will be swimming in loot, like I said. So you can go to any vending machine you want and buy any amount of ammo that you want, and you'll never really run out. You have all of these gear items that will, they're basically clothes that replace gene tonics in this particular game. So those give you tons of passive bonuses, and I actually found that the ones you get first for every slot are perfectly fine throughout the entire game. So I never actually changed those out, except for when I got the one that allows me to move quickly off of skylines. But the enemies are a lot less bullet spongy, except for the few that are heavily armored and have certain weak points that you have to hit. And whenever you die in this game, you just get brought right back with less money. And it really also doesn't help that this is, don't get me wrong, this is a pretty decent mechanic here, but it also helps the game be a lot easier, and that is Elizabeth finding things for you.
That'll do.
She will actually run around the level while you're fighting, and occasionally she'll be like, hey, Booker, catch this, and she'll throw you some ammo or some salts or a health kit. And so that makes it a lot easier. And when you're not in combat, she'll throw you some silver eagles, which is the currency in the game. So it's a really, really easy game. And you're basically an unstoppable juggernaut of death. But I think that's kind of the point. And this game does something that I didn't really expect it to do. Now, in the previous games, the violence was just there. It was just part of the game. They were FPSs, big deal. In this one, it pretty much questions the use of violence. And whenever violence is used in the game, Elizabeth in particular is horrified by it. And disgusted, particularly when you do the execution moves with the skyhook. So, it kind of has a way of saying, hey, violence isn't necessarily a good thing, obviously. And it's one of those things where you're fighting for survival, and Booker actually rationalizes it, hey, we're just trying to survive here. We're trying to get away from this stuff. And yet, it still questions it. And it doesn't really make it judgmental questioning. It's just, it poses the question and leaves you to garner your own conclusions. Which, in turn, leads me to the storyline. Now, you have to keep in mind that the story is actually the primary focus of the game, and as a result, I really don't want to spoil it for you. Because I really do feel that if you go into this game having the story spoiled for you, it really makes it a very, very different experience. I went into this thing having avoided as many spoilers as I possibly could. I basically stuck to the pre-release trailers, and that was about it. I didn't read reviews, I didn't look at any story summaries or anything like that. I went into this thing not really knowing what was going on. I knew some basics, but I didn't know how the actual plot worked out in the end. And as a result, I can really speak from that particular perspective. But I do know somebody who had the story spoiled for him before he went in, and he said that while it did help him understand some things better, it really wasn't quite the experience that someone like me would have. Having gone into this thing, really avoiding information on the game as much as possible. So, all that said, that is why I'm using gameplay footage from the very early portions of the game. I really don't want to spoil it for you. And actually, any spoilers that get posted that aren't from the very, very early portions of the game, I'm actually going to delete those comments, so please refrain from doing so. But the story follows Booker DeWitt. He is a former Pinkerton agent, which, if you're not familiar with that, it was a detective agency in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And he also was in the 7th Cavalry at Wounded Knee. So he has a rather violent past. The Pinkertons were not exactly the most upstanding of detectives, let's put it that way. And he has also accrued this large debt, and he has received this offer where they will wipe away his debt if he brings them this woman named Elizabeth who lives in the city of Columbia. So, of course, he takes them up on that offer and goes off to the city of Columbia to find Elizabeth and bring her back. And when he gets there, he finds out some very interesting things. First off, Columbia is a city in the sky. It's flying. And so, obviously, that creates a very different dynamic from what you see in BioShock 1 and 2. Particularly considering that Columbia is also thriving. You get to see it in its prime, basically. You get to see it where people are going about their daily lives, doing whatever it is they do, working their jobs, enjoying cafes and books and all sorts of things like that. And it's a wildly different feeling from what you get when you play through BioShock 1 and 2. Where you're trying to find out what happened to get the Rapture in such a horrible state. In this one, you're really more exploring what led to Columbia being the way it is. And its underlying problems, so to speak. And throughout all of this, Booker himself has his own outlook on things. He has an identity. He has his own personality. And you can actually sympathize with this guy the whole time because he really does come across as a very human character despite his violent tendencies. He has emotions. He feels things. And he has this kind of cynical vibe going about him because, you know, he's seen a lot. He's gone through a lot in his life, and obviously that would render any man just hardened against the world. But when you contrast him with the character of Elizabeth, who follows you throughout most of the game, it's an interesting dynamic, because he's the more experienced, world-weary, often rather violent man, who really doesn't want to be a violent man. He's just stuck doing it because he has to be. And you have Elizabeth, who has lived in a tower her whole life. She's been sheltered from everything. And despite knowing a lot of things by reading a lot of books, she doesn't have much practical experience with the world. And so she's a very naive character at the beginning of the game, and you actually see her grow and mature over time. And so that actually becomes very interesting, and the relationship between Booker and Elizabeth as the game progresses becomes a very interesting dynamic. And you can really sympathize with Elizabeth as well. You grow attached to her over time just because she has personality, she has an identity. And that's something that really doesn't happen very much in an FPS. These characters will actually bring you through the story, and at certain points in the game, I was actually feeling things because certain things were happening to the characters, and I was just like, no, not that, no, stop it, stop it, game. And it wasn't in a manner of, oh, the game's doing something bad. No, it was doing it so well that it actually affected me. So that's worth saying. Now, all that said, what about Columbia itself? Because Columbia is a very interesting city. Again, you're seeing it in its prime. You're seeing it where people are going about their daily lives, and you're seeing both the good and the bad. And this game has some interesting themes about it. And the way it goes about a lot of these themes is particularly interesting. First off, the very obvious one, the theme of racism, which the game is set in 1912. You'd kind of expect that, and particularly in a very traditional American society like Columbia. And by traditional, I mean extremist conservative. What ends up happening is you'll be going into this place and you'll be experiencing racism firsthand. Now, obviously, Booker is not a black person or a Latino or anything like that. He's a white guy, but he's running into all these sorts of things, and you get to see all this stuff firsthand. And the weird thing is how the game actually does it. It's not judgmental on it. It just shows it for what it is. And that's it. It just leaves you to really come to your own conclusions. And in fact, the characters in the game come to their own conclusions. One of the really standout points in the game to me, as far as the racism went, was this completely insignificant dialogue between Booker and Elizabeth, where she asked him about why there are separate restrooms for whites and colored people. And he just said, it just is. He didn't really have an explanation for it, obviously. And she just remarks that it just seems inefficient to her. So they don't really make any real judgments about it. It's just, it's there. And that's the way it is with a lot of these themes. These themes of extremist belief, where you have the religion that is binding everything in Colombia together, where they're effectively worshiping the three founding fathers that they think are amazing: Ben Franklin, George Washington, and Thomas Jefferson. And they're effectively worshiping them. They have the great prophet, who is effectively their Moses. And he has this gift of foresight, so to speak. And they have this really fanatical devotion to this religion. They see themselves as superior to everything else. It deals with a lot of that sort of thing. It deals with pretty much American imperialism as well. All of these things, it just shows it and leaves you to garner your own conclusions, to get your own feelings on the matter. It just has it. And the weird thing is, a lot of this extremist stuff does not feel like it was thrown in there to be shocking or just excessive or anything like that. It feels like it fits perfectly into the game. And it feels like a very natural extension of the place itself. You're seeing all this extremism unfold around you, and yet the game's just like, yes, this place is extremist. That's up to you to decide whether that's a good thing or not. Obviously, it does lead to some very dire consequences, but then it also poses those questions about extremism in itself, and the idea of fanaticism in religion and fanatical beliefs and such like that. And there is an absolutely massive amount of symbology in this game, where you'll just instantly associate things because you've seen these symbols before just in your day-to-day life, and you never really thought of it. But when you see them out of context, and you see them in this context of Colombia, and how they've sort of mutated them into this very unique atmosphere, it really does create a big sense of familiarity with the world. It's a very interesting thing. For instance, the Vox Populi. You don't really think too much of them until you really see the what happens later on in the game, but you do also see that they have the color red as their big thing. And instantly in your mind, you don't even think of why else they might use it. You instantly think stuff like the Bolsheviks. And these associations just make the game feel much more in-depth. It uses a lot of symbology to imply things and to make you draw your own conclusions and insinuate your own things rather than just spoon-feeding you everything. And that's one thing I really feel like the plot does really well. It tells you things without explicitly telling you them. It expects you to be intelligent. It does not treat you like an idiot. It expects you to be able to go into this thing and, using the information it does give you, to put together your own conclusions and really get why things are the way they are and what these things lead to and that sort of thing. So it's actually a very intelligently done story. And When you actually get to the meat of the story, where it involves the whole plot with Elizabeth and her abilities, where she can actually open tears in reality, basically, to... it's sort of like a space-time thing. It's kind of weird to explain without really going into specifics. But when it gets into that meat of that story, it just goes all over the place. And it really does expect you to be able to piece together things from the information it does give you. And that leads me to the ending. A lot of people seem to think that the ending is extremely confusing, and that's because it blows your mind and everything. Well, no. Honestly, the ending is so mind-blowing because it makes so much sense. The ending basically ties literally everything from BioShock Infinite together. And it does it in a way that it really does expect you to just have been paying attention throughout the entire game. It doesn't go into explanations of things. It just has this ending, this very mind-blowing ending. And then all of a sudden, everything from BioShock Infinite makes total sense. And the implications that the ending has just go further and further and further into interesting ways. So, honestly, it's pretty hard to pull off a space-time kind of story without it really coming across as stupid. And I know there are a lot of people out there who feel like the story is stupid because space-time and it doesn't make any sense. The thing is, it makes total sense. In fact, it makes so much sense it blows your mind. So, what do I think about BioShock Infinite that I haven't already said? What can I summarize my thoughts as? Well, I can summarize it as this. BioShock Infinite is a first-person shooter that mechanically is nothing particularly impressive. But the way it's written, the dynamic between the characters, the setting, all blends together to make the gameplay actually insignificant. It didn't matter that I found the gameplay to be just at best. I found myself so engrossed in the story, in the characters, in the setting, that I completely forgave it for the gameplay. And even then, the gameplay in this thing is outright better than BioShock 1 and 2's. But, despite having really enjoyed this game and thinking that it is just a really well-made first-person shooter as far as its storytelling and such go, where it puts you really into everything and how intelligently it treats you and all that, despite really enjoying the game, I can't recommend it to everyone. And there are a couple of simple reasons for it. The first being, it is a first-person shooter. And as far as first-person shooters go, it is not the most accessible, it is not the best first-person shooter out there. Or a shining example of first-person shooter gameplay. Second thing being, if you can't wrap your head around the story, you are not going to enjoy it. If you do not enjoy space-time, sci-fi kind of things, you will not enjoy the story. If you do not enjoy games where, or not even necessarily games, just stories where it doesn't just explicitly tell you everything, and you have to piece together your own conclusions based on the information it does give you, you will not enjoy it. But for the rest of us, those of us who really do enjoy things like that, it is an absolutely phenomenal game. I give it a 4.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.